Clear the federal alert on that container, my father demanded over the phone, completely ignoring that I was a criminal detective. And wire 50,000 to the usual account. When I stayed silent, he laughed a dry, grating sound. You wear that badge just to protect this family. Victoria, don't ever forget, you are completely replaceable. He thought my uniform was his personal shield. He thought my silence was submission. He didn't realise I was already drafting a federal conflict of interest report. If my loyalty was replaceable, so was my protection. Before we continue, tell me what time it is, where you are, and which city you are watching from. Because I want to know how far this story has travelled. I did not go back to sleep. I put on a heavy coat over my plain clothes and drove toward the North Shore. I was not going there to argue with Craig. Arguments with manipulators only give them the oxygen they crave. I parked 2 blocks away from the sprawling, heavily gated property that my salary helped subsidise. The night air was freezing, biting through my jacket as I walked up the driveway. I bypassed the front door entirely and used the keypad for the side service entrance. The house was quiet, but it was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet. I did not care about confronting Craig or Patricia right now. I cared about the collateral damage. I moved silently down the hallway toward the utility wing. I opened the door to the laundry room. It was pitch black, except for the faint glow of a street lamp filtering through the high window. In the corner, wedged between the dryer and a pile of discarded moving boxes, was Leo. He was 7 years old, pulling his knees tightly to his chest. When the door opened, he flinched, but his breathing hitched when he saw my silhouette. "Aunt Victoria," he whispered. His voice was trembling, barely audible over the hum of the house's massive heating system. I crouched down slowly, keeping my movements predictable and calm. "I am right here. Leo," I said softly. "There are strange men downstairs again," he murmured, his small hands gripping my sleeve. "I didn't know who to call, but I know your number." He tapped his forehead. "I memorised it, just like you told me." I pulled him into a tight embrace. The smell of expensive cigars and stale whiskey drifted faintly from the main house. Logan, his father, was nowhere to be seen. Patricia and Craig were likely entertaining their shadow partners. In that cold laundry room, holding a terrified child who used my phone number as a lifeline, everything crystallised. I could not simply pack my bags and cut off contact. That would leave Leo in a war zone. I had to dismantle the war zone entirely. It was exactly 11:45 at night. I made my choice. At 8 o'clock sharp the next morning, I walked into the precinct. The bullpen was loud, filled with the clatter of keyboards, ringing phones, and the smell of burnt coffee. I walked straight to my desk. I did not log into the federal database. I did not run the container numbers Craig had given me over the phone. I did not look up Logan's vehicle registrations. Doing any of those things would have made me a rogue cop. It would have compromised everything. In the real world, justice is not served by kicking down doors without a warrant. Justice is served by immaculate, untouchable paperwork. I opened a blank document on my computer. I began typing a formal conflict of interest report. I documented the phone call from Craig. I detailed his specific request for me to abuse my clearance. I listed the container numbers he mentioned. I explicitly stated that my family members were potentially involved in illicit logistics operations. By putting this on official precinct letterhead, I was legally removing myself from any future investigation. I was building a firewall between my badge and their crimes, and I printed 3 copies. I signed each one with a steady hand. My heart rate was completely normal. I did not feel fear. I felt the profound clarity that comes with absolute detachment. I walked upstairs to the office of the Federal Task Force Liaison. His name was Agent Miller. I knocked twice and entered. I placed the file on his desk. "I am reporting a direct conflict of interest. Agent Miller," I said, my voice strictly professional. My father requested unauthorized clearance on a port container. I'm submitting this intelligence to your unit. From this moment on, I am a cooperating witness, not an investigator. Miller read the first page. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. He understood exactly what I was doing. I was handing over my family to the federal government on a silver platter. I walked out of his office feeling lighter than I had in a decade. The ink was dry. 48 hours later, the retaliation began. I was sitting in the precinct break room, holding a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. The television mounted on the wall was playing the local morning news. A breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. The anchor announced that a major federal raid on a suspected smuggling warehouse on the south side had yielded nothing. The warehouse was completely empty. It had been scrubbed clean. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Craig had not trusted me. The container numbers he gave me were bait. He wanted to see if the feds would show up. When they did, he knew I had crossed the line. He knew I had chosen the law over his twisted version of loyalty. Then, the anchor's expression turned serious. In a related development, she said, an anonymous source has released an audio recording suggesting corruption within the police department. The broadcast played the audio. It was my voice. Give me the container numbers. I will handle it at the port. It sounded incredibly damning. The media spun it as a dirty cop agreeing to protect a smuggling ring. I knew exactly what they had done. Craig had recorded our conversation, isolated my words, and edited out the rest of my sentence. The original audio was, "Give me the container numbers. I will handle it at the port by reporting it to the proper authorities. Do not call me again." My phone began to vibrate relentlessly. Calls from unknown reporters, texts from panicked colleagues. I finished my coffee and tossed the cup in the trash. The break room door opened. 2 men in crisp dark suits walked in. Internal affairs. They did not look friendly. "Detective Victoria," the taller one said, holding up a badge. "We need you to come with us. Now." I stood up slowly. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or proclaim my innocence to the room. I simply nodded. I knew this was coming. They took my gun. They placed me on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I was confined to my small, sparsely furnished apartment, stripped of my badge and my weapon. Craig probably thought I would panic. He probably thought I would come crawling back to the mansion, begging for his expensive lawyers to save my career. He severely miscalculated. I spent the first day methodically cleaning my apartment. As I wiped down the counters, I thought about the luxury of the North Shore house. I thought about the trap of cruel normalization. For years, I had believed that subsidizing their lifestyle was just the cost of being part of a family. Patricia had conditioned me flawlessly. She never yelled. She used soft disappointment and heavy guilt. I remembered visiting the mansion a few months ago. Patricia had smiled warmly, telling me, "This will always be your home, Victoria." Yet, when I walked upstairs to use the bathroom, I glanced into my old childhood bedroom. My bed was gone. My bookshelf was gone. The room had been entirely converted into a makeshift office. There were towering stacks of logistics manifests, filing cabinets, and a heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sitting right where my desk used to be. I did not have a room in their home. I had a utility space. Every family dinner I ever attended ended the exact same way. When the plates were cleared, Patricia would slide a thick white envelope across the mahogany table. It would stop right next to my water glass. Inside were credit card bills in Logan's name, property tax notices, and high premium insurance invoices. They never asked how my shifts were going. They never asked if the job was dangerous. They just watched me open the envelope, expecting me to quietly transfer my clean, hard-earned money to cover their exorbitant liabilities. It was a transaction disguised as a family gathering. I sprayed cleaner on the mirror and wiped it away. I was not angry anymore. Anger is exhausting. Clarity is efficient. I kept sweeping dust. While the internal affairs investigation kept me confined to my apartment, I had time. Time is the greatest enemy of a fabricated life. For years. I had been paying off a massive loan. Craig had told me it was a joint family liability, a necessary $50,000 to save Logan from a catastrophic business failure. Because I was the only one with a spotless credit history and a government salary. I assumed the burden. I logged into my secured banking portal and pulled the original promissory note from the digital archives. I zoomed in on the electronic signature. It was mine, but the curvature of the letters was entirely too perfect. It was a digital clone. I cross-referenced the date. On that exact day, 9 years ago, Patricia had asked me to sign a stack of routine health insurance renewals for the family plan. She had slipped a signature authorization form into the pile. But the betrayal went deeper than a forged document. I tracked the origin of the $50,000. It did not come from a commercial lender. The funds were transferred from a trust account. My grandfather had set up an educational fund for me before he died. Patricia and Craig had liquidated my college fund to pay off Logan's underground debts. Then, they structured the empty account as a high-interest loan and attached my name to the repayment schedule. They had stolen my future to save their favourite child. Then, they had the audacity to make me pay back the very money they stole, using my police salary. Every month, I had dutifully sent them $800, believing I was being a responsible daughter. I looked at the screen, feeling the cold glow illuminate my face. I did not shed a tear. Tears are for mistakes. This was a calculated financial assault. I paid my own ransom. Agent Miller did not come to my apartment. He summoned me to a neutral federal building downtown. The interrogation room was sterile, painted a pale beige with a single metal table. He slid a thick manila folder across the surface. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me like a puzzle he was trying to solve. "Detective," Miller said softly, "are you aware that you are the primary owner of a commercial freight holding company?" I opened the folder. The registration documents listed my full legal name. The corporate address was my exact apartment number. The emergency contact was my personal cell phone. There were 6 associated bank accounts, processing hundreds of thousands of dollars in offshore transfers. I stared at the paper. I did not panic. I simply analysed the data like a crime scene. Craig had not just asked me to clear a port container to test my loyalty. He had built an entire architectural failsafe around my identity. If the federal task force ever raided his operations, the paper trail would completely bypass the luxurious North Shore mansion. It would lead federal agents directly to the cramped apartment of a city detective. He had designed the perfect narrative, the corrupt cop running a smuggling ring from the shadows. I did not sign these. I told Miller, my voice perfectly level. "We are running handwriting diagnostics," Miller replied. "But on paper, you look like a cartel boss. Victoria." I closed the folder and aligned the edges perfectly with the table. Craig had kept me close, demanded my presence at family dinners, and insisted on paying my phone bill just to maintain the illusion of a connected network. He did not love his daughter. He loved his insurance policy. I looked up at Miller. I was the perfect alibi. Miller allowed me to review the bank statements seized during their preliminary sweeps. I ran my finger down the columns of numbers. Craig was a logistics man, but he was messy with details. The ledgers were immaculate. The handwriting in the margins was elegant, looping, and unmistakably familiar. It was Patricia. My mother was not just the silent wife of a smuggler. She was the financial architect of the entire operation. I noticed a recurring pattern in the deposit columns. Every time I had transferred $2,000 to help cover their property taxes or Logan's emergency expenses. Patricia had routed the money through 3 different holding accounts. Beside my transfers, she had written logistics consulting revenue. The realization was a quiet, clinical absolute. My money was clean. It came directly from a municipal payroll. It was fully taxed and completely transparent. Patricia had intentionally demanded money from me, not because she needed it for groceries, but because she needed clean capital to mix with their dirty cash. By blending my legitimate police salary with their illicit funds, she washed their accounts clean. "You wear that uniform just to protect this house," Craig had said. He meant it literally. My badge was not just a tool for intimidation. My badge was their financial detergent. Patricia had manipulated my sense of duty, playing the vulnerable mother, all while methodically structuring my hard-earned money to shield Logan from federal prison. She had turned my profound love for my family into an instrument of organised crime. I closed my eyes for 3 seconds, absorbing the absolute magnitude of the manipulation. My badge was their detergent. I left the federal building and walked 3 blocks to a private bank vault. When my Uncle Harold died 4 years ago, he left me an envelope containing a single brass key and a sequence of numbers. Harold had been a homicide detective. He was a quiet man who watched Craig's sudden wealth with silent, calculating eyes. I never understood why he left me the key instead of his own children, until today. I signed the access log and the attendant led me to the vault. The metal box was heavy. Inside, there was no smoking gun. There were no photographs of illegal contraband. Harold knew that raw evidence could be dismissed as circumstantial. Instead, he left me a roadmap. I pulled out a leather-bound notebook, a stack of faded shipping invoices, the business card of a retired forensic accountant, and a handwritten note on a yellow legal pad. The ink was faded, but the instruction was clear. Do not trust the company names. Victoria. They change them every month. Look at the container numbers. Follow the steel. Harold had known. He had spent his retirement quietly gathering the foundational threads of his brother's criminal empire. He did not have the jurisdiction to arrest Craig, but he knew that one day I would need a shield. He knew that the family would eventually turn their machinery against me. He had spent years building a structural defense and left it in the dark, waiting for the day I finally woke up. I placed the notebook in my briefcase. The ghost left a map. I returned to my apartment and spread Harold's documents across the living room floor. In financial crime, the objective is never the physical contraband. The objective is the paper trail. Justice is not a dramatic shootout. Justice is a meticulously documented discrepancy. I sat cross-legged, comparing Harold's old container serial numbers with the records Miller had shown me. A memory flashed in my mind. Leo sitting on the mansion's expensive rug, playing with heavy-duty shipping stickers Craig had tossed him from his coat pocket. Leo used them to decorate his school binders. I went to my closet and pulled down a shoebox filled with crayon drawings and crafts Leo had made for me. I found a cardboard folder covered in bright orange shipping barcodes. I read the 12-digit serial number on the sticker. I cross-referenced it with Harold's ledger and Craig's recent insurance claims. It was a perfect match. The exact same shipping container had been reported as empty transit by one shell company. 2 weeks later, another company claimed it as a total loss for an insurance payout. A month after that, a third company registered it as an imported asset. 3 different companies, 3 different tax events, 1 single steel box. The protocol became crystal clear. Patricia was generating phantom losses to offset their illicit gains. I did not need to kick down the mansion door. I did not need a confession. I had the undeniable geometry of fraud. The ink was my weapon. The financial ledger I retrieved from Uncle Harold's safety deposit box was a masterpiece of hidden truths. I spent a Tuesday evening sitting on my living room floor, cross-referencing his handwritten notes with the digital bank statements Agent Miller had provided. I was looking for anomalies in the shell companies, but I found a completely different kind of crime. It was a recurring monthly wire transfer of exactly $4,000. The payments originated from a secondary account under Craig's name, but they were routed through a private wealth management firm before depositing into a small regional bank in Ohio. I traced the receiving account. The name on the profile made my blood turn to ice. It was Elena. She was Leo's biological mother. For 7 years. The narrative dictated by Patricia was absolute. Elena was an unstable, unfit woman who abandoned her child in the middle of the night because she did not want the burden of motherhood. We were told she vanished without a trace, leaving poor Logan to raise the boy alone. That was the story I had believed. That was the story that made me feel obligated to help provide for Leo. The documents told a vastly different reality. I found a corresponding legal fee paid to a notoriously ruthless family attorney 3 days before Eleanor supposedly disappeared. It was billed as a consultation for a coerced relinquishment of parental rights. Patricia had not stepped up to save an abandoned child. She had methodically threatened a vulnerable, terrified young woman. She had used Craig's underworld connections to intimidate Eleanor, forced her to sign away her custody rights under extreme duress, and then exiled her to another state. The $4,000 a month was not child support. It was hush money. It was an extortion payment designed to keep a broken mother away from her own son. Patricia had purchased my nephew like a piece of high-end furniture to maintain the illusion of a perfect, wealthy family structure, keeping Logan tethered to the mansion. I stared at the wire transfer receipts for a long time. The sheer, calculating cruelty required to rip a child from a mother and then systematically erase her existence was staggering. I carefully placed the documents into a clear plastic evidence sleeve. I did not feel a single ounce of familial obligation left in my body. She bought a child. For my entire life, Craig was the loud, commanding presence who supposedly ran the family empire. He was the one who demanded respect, the one who barked orders, and the one who claimed I was entirely replaceable. He played the role of the dangerous patriarch flawlessly. But as I continued my audit of the financial records, the illusion of his power began to rapidly dissolve. Craig was nothing more than the physical muscle. He was a glorified foreman handling the dirty logistics at the port. The real mastermind was sitting quietly in the dining room, pouring expensive wine and talking about family unity. It was Patricia. The evidence was glaringly obvious to anyone trained in forensic accounting. Craig was a man who could barely compose a coherent email without spelling errors. Yet, the wire transfers routing illicit funds through offshore accounts were executed with immaculate precision. The corporate structures of the shell companies utilised advanced tax loopholes. The routing protocols were highly sophisticated. I analysed the digital timestamps on the most complex financial manoeuvres. The IP addresses consistently pinged from the mansion's dedicated home office during the exact hours Craig was physically present at the shipping yards. Patricia was the one dividing the money to avoid federal reporting thresholds. Patricia was the one who had forged my signature on the corporate registration forms. She had built an entire ecosystem of fraud from her mahogany desk. She utilised Logan as the ultimate fall guy, a convenient idiot who would take the blame if the operation collapsed. And she had utilised me as the clean, respectable shield. My uniform and my clean credit score were just assets she managed. She had engineered a system where both of her children were nothing more than human capital. She was not a misguided mother trying to keep her family afloat. She was the chief financial officer of a criminal syndicate. The mother was the monster. The walls were closing in on the North Shore mansion, and the rats were beginning to sense the shifting tide. On a Thursday afternoon, My personal cell phone rang. It was an unregistered burner number. I answered cautiously. It was Logan. His voice was erratic, his breathing shallow and panicked. He knew the federal task force was circling. He knew Craig's usual protective measures were failing. Victoria, you have to help me, Logan pleaded, his words tumbling over each other. I know everything. I know where Mom hides the secondary ledgers. I can give you the exact location of the next shipment. Just promise me you can get the feds to offer me immunity. I will turn state's evidence today. For a brief second, I thought my brother was finally stepping up. I thought he was finally choosing to do the right thing for his son. I instructed him to meet me at a neutral, heavily monitored diner on the edge of the city. I told him to bring Leo and the documents. I waited in a corner booth for 3 hours. The coffee turned cold. The diner slowly emptied. At 6 p.m, a text message illuminated my screen from the same burner number. I am sorry, Vic. You are a cop. You will know how to take care of the boy. I only have one chance to run. Logan had not gathered evidence. He had used the chaos to empty Craig's emergency cash reserves from the hidden safe. He had taken $200,000 and fled the state, completely abandoning his 7-year-old son in a house currently targeted by federal agents. He had been given a final opportunity for redemption, and he chose himself. He chose the money over his own blood. I deleted the message and stood up. I did not waste time feeling disappointed. Logan had simply confirmed exactly who he was. He chose the money. I did not drive to the mansion with my siren blaring. I did not kick down the heavy oak doors to pull my nephew out of a hostile environment. Acting on raw emotion is exactly how cases are compromised and careers are destroyed. I was a detective. I operated entirely within the boundaries of the law. I picked up my phone and called the emergency hotline for Child Protective Services. I identified myself formally and requested an immediate intervention. I provided them with documented, verifiable facts. I reported that a 7-year-old child had been abandoned by his primary custodial parent. I informed them that the residence was currently occupied by individuals under active federal investigation for organised crime. I detailed the frequent presence of unknown individuals with extensive criminal records entering and exiting the property. It was a textbook child endangerment scenario. Within 45 minutes, 2 social workers, escorted by uniformed patrol officers, arrived at the mansion. Craig and Patricia were completely powerless against a lawful welfare check. They could not use their money or their intimidation tactics against the state. The social workers legally extracted Leo from the premises under an emergency protective order. Because I had already submitted my conflict of interest report and maintained a spotless record. I was legally positioned as a safe, verified relative. I petitioned the family court for temporary emergency placement. That evening, a social worker brought Leo to my small apartment. He walked in, clutching a small backpack, looking bewildered but deeply relieved. I made him a simple dinner of toasted sandwiches. I set up a quiet space for him in my spare room. There were no strange men downstairs. There were no hushed, threatening arguments in the hallway. For the first time in his life, my nephew went to sleep in an environment that was completely, entirely safe. The shield was broken. The federal task force officially raided the logistics company headquarters the following morning. They seized servers, filing cabinets, and Patricia's personal laptop. I was sitting at my kitchen table, helping Leo with a puzzle, when Agent Miller called me. His voice carried a tone of genuine disbelief. He asked me to come to the field office immediately. When I arrived, Miller guided me to a secure digital forensics lab. A technician had cracked the encryption on Patricia's hard drive. Miller pointed to the glowing monitor. "Your mother is a profoundly dangerous woman, Victoria," he said quietly. Displayed on the screen were 3 distinct, meticulously organised digital folders. They were contingency plans, built long before any investigation began. Patricia had prepared absolute destruction for her entire family just to ensure her own survival. The first folder contained a manufactured trail of evidence designed to throw Craig completely under the bus, framing him as the sole mastermind. The second folder contained falsified emails and debt records, prepared to pin the entire financial fraud on Logan. But it was the third folder that solidified my resolve. It was labelled with my badge number. Inside, Patricia had drafted anonymous letters to Internal Affairs. She had curated manipulated bank statements, making it appear as though I was actively extorting money from their business to fund a lavish lifestyle. She had documented my visits to the house, spinning them as meetings to collect illicit payouts. She had built a complete, fabricated narrative ready to send her own daughter to federal prison the moment she felt cornered. I stared at the screen. I did not feel betrayal. Betrayal implies that trust existed in the first place. I simply felt the cold satisfaction of total validation. Every boundary I had drawn was completely necessary. If you discovered your own mother had meticulously planned to send you to federal prison to protect her lifestyle, what would your very first move be? Tell me your perspective in the comments. She planned to survive. The evidence was no longer just a collection of disjointed anomalies. It was a fully synthesized, undeniable narrative of corporate fraud and systemic money laundering. I sat in Agent Miller's office as the federal prosecutor reviewed the final dossier. The document was 3 inches thick. It detailed every shell company, every forged signature, and every phantom logistics manifest Patricia had engineered. The prosecutor did not ask for my testimony. He did not need it. The paper trail was absolute. He drafted the motions for the federal judge. We were seeking asset freezing under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO is a beautiful piece of legislation when applied correctly. It does not just stop a criminal operation, it completely suffocates it. It freezes bank accounts, seizes physical properties, and halts all financial transactions associated with the corrupt enterprise. As the prosecutor finalised the paperwork, my mind drifted back to the digital folders we had found on Patricia's laptop. The sheer, calculating cruelty of her design was something I was still processing. She had built a financial washing machine, and she had fueled it with my clean salary. But it was not just about the money. It was about the utter lack of maternal instinct. She had meticulously crafted a framework where her own daughter would face decades in federal prison if her empire ever faced scrutiny. She had weaponized my love, my loyalty, and my badge. She had treated me as a highly expendable asset. I also verified the legal standing of Uncle Harold's irrevocable trust for Leo. The prosecutor confirmed what I already suspected, because the trust was established by Harold with his own legitimate pension funds and managed by an independent third-party fiduciary. Patricia could not touch it. It was completely insulated from the RICO seizures. Leo's future was mathematically and legally secure. The contrast between my uncle's quiet protection and my mother's loud betrayal was staggering. Harold had built a fortress. Patricia had built a trap. The judge signed the orders at exactly 2 p.m. The federal hammer was coming down, and it was entirely constructed of paper. Warrants were issued for Craig and Logan. The freezing orders were transmitted directly to the banking institutions. Every single dollar they had stolen, washed, or hoarded was instantly locked behind a wall of federal cryptography. They were currently sitting in their massive North Shore mansion, completely unaware that their empire had already been dismantled in a quiet courtroom downtown. I went home and prepared my dress uniform for the next day. I spent 30 minutes carefully ironing the dark fabric, making sure every crease was perfectly sharp. I polished my badge until it gleamed. I ironed the uniform. The convoy of black federal vehicles moved through the affluent North Shore neighbourhood just before sunrise. The sky was a bruised purple, and the manicured lawns were covered in a thin layer of morning frost. I parked my personal vehicle half a block away from the mansion. I was not there in any official capacity. I was not there to execute the warrant. I was there simply to witness the conclusion of an illusion. Agent Miller had secured the perimeter. The tactical team approached the heavy oak doors. They did not need to use a battering ram. The element of surprise was absolute. Within 10 minutes, the house was fully secured. I stood by my car, leaning against the cold metal, watching the scene unfold with total emotional detachment. I did not feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt the steady, methodical rhythm of a process completing its final sequence. The front doors opened. 2 federal agents escorted Craig out into the freezing morning air. He was wearing an expensive silk robe over his pajamas. His face was a mask of furious indignation. He barked threats at the agents, demanding to speak to his lawyers, claiming they had no idea who they were dealing with. He still believed his money and his connections made him invincible. He still believed he was the untouchable patriarch of an empire. Then, he saw me standing by my car. The furious shouting stopped instantly. His eyes narrowed, assessing the situation. He realized I was not wearing my tactical gear. He realized I was not standing with the arrest team. He processed the reality that I had orchestrated his downfall without ever stepping onto his property. Craig pulled away from the agent slightly and took a step toward the edge of the driveway. He held out his wrists, displaying them toward me. He tilted his chin up, offering a mocking, challenging glare. He wanted me to walk over. He wanted me to put the handcuffs on him myself. He wanted to frame this as a personal vendetta, a dramatic family betrayal. He desperately needed to pull me down into the mud with him to validate his own narrative. I did not move. I did not flinch. I kept my hands resting easily inside the pockets of my winter coat. I looked at him with the polite, indifferent expression one might give a stranger causing a scene at a grocery store. I refused to let my badge become a tool for his psychological theatre. I nodded to Agent Miller. Miller stepped forward and secured the steel cuffs around Craig's wrists. The metallic click echoed sharply in the quiet neighbourhood. Logan was nowhere to be seen, having already fled like a coward. Patricia was brought out next. She looked deeply offended rather than afraid. She tried to catch my eye, attempting to deploy that familiar look of maternal disappointment. I simply turned my head and looked at the frost clinging to the windshield of my car. Her silent manipulations had lost their frequency. They put him inside. By noon, the financial shockwaves hit the surface. A RICO freeze does not politely ask for cooperation. It forcefully paralyzes everything. Patricia had been released on her own recognizance pending formal indictment, entirely because her role was initially perceived as secondary. The feds wanted to follow the money, and letting her try to access it was the fastest way to map the remaining hidden accounts. They did not realize she was the architect. I was sitting at my kitchen table, organizing my defense files for the upcoming Internal Affairs Tribunal, when my phone rang. It was Patricia. I answered, placing the device on speakerphone so I could continue highlighting documents. "Victoria," she said. Her voice was trembling, a carefully constructed performance of maternal distress. "My cards are declining. The bank teller told me my accounts are locked under federal order. I cannot buy groceries. I cannot pay the landscapers. You have to call whoever is in charge and explain this is a terrible mistake." She was still trying to use me as her personal fixer. She still believed my uniform was a master key to her problems. "I cannot do that. Patricia," I said smoothly. I did not call her mom. That word belonged to a relationship that never existed. "You are my daughter," she sobbed. "You are supposed to protect your family. We are going to lose the house. We are going to lose everything. You have to fix this." I kept highlighting a paragraph in my conflict of interest report. The federal court has restricted all assets tied to illicit logistics revenue, I explained, using the sterile language of a compliance officer. The process is incredibly thorough. Any entirely clean, legitimate income will eventually be released back to you. Do you have any entirely clean income? Patricia. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy void. She knew exactly what I was asking. She knew that every dollar she possessed had been washed through a cycle of fraud. She knew I had seen the ledgers. The performance dropped instantly. She did not scream. She simply hung up the phone. If you have ever witnessed the exact moment a manipulator realizes their control is entirely gone, tell me about that silence in the comments. Is there any sound quite like it? I went back to my paperwork. Tomorrow. I had to face the Internal Affairs Division. Craig and Patricia had deployed their contingency plan, utilising their expensive defence attorney to file a vicious complaint against me. They wanted to strip me of my badge. I gathered my audited bank statements, the forged corporate registrations, and the unedited audio file. I placed them neatly into a hard plastic briefcase. I went to the spare room and kissed Leo gently on the forehead as he slept. Tomorrow was about protecting his sanctuary. I snapped the briefcase. The Internal Affairs Division operates out of a windowless suite on the 4th floor of the Central Precinct. The air always smells faintly of ozone and stale floor wax. I walked into the designated hearing room at exactly 9 in the morning. I sat at the rectangular table, placing my plastic briefcase gently on the surface. Across from me sat Inspector Hayes, a veteran officer known for his relentless, unsmiling interrogations. Sitting next to Hayes was Vance. He was a high-priced defence attorney Craig retained on a permanent basis. Vance wore a bespoke suit and a smile that reeked of arrogant confidence. He was not there to defend Craig. He was there to execute Patricia's contingency plan. He was there to assassinate my character. Detective Victoria, Vance began, not waiting for Inspector Hayes to initiate the proceedings. He spoke with the theatrical cadence of a man performing for a jury, even though the room only held 3 people. We are here to discuss a deeply troubling pattern of corruption, extortion, and familial abuse. He reached into his designer leather bag and pulled out a stack of documents. He slid them dramatically across the table. These are corporate registration forms, Vance stated, tapping the paper with a manicured finger. They explicitly list you as the primary owner of a logistics firm currently under federal indictment for money laundering. They show your name, your home address, and your signature. I looked at the documents. I did not speak. I simply let him continue his performance. Vance pulled out a digital recorder and pressed play. My own voice echoed in the small room. Give me the container numbers. I will handle it at the port. Vance paused the recording and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. You used your position to guarantee safe passage for contraband, and you used your family's business to mask the profits. When my client, your father, finally refused to pay your extortion demands, you spitefully triggered a federal investigation to destroy him. You are not a whistleblower, detective. You are a corrupt officer trying to eliminate your accomplices. Inspector Hayes watched me closely, his eyes completely neutral. He was waiting for a reaction. He was waiting for the typical panic of an officer caught in a lie. He expected me to raise my voice, to bang my fists on the table, to furiously deny the allegations. That is what guilty people do. Vance was a man who made his living intimidating witnesses and twisting facts until they broke. He relied on volume and momentum. He assumed my silence was a sign of capitulation. He did not realise that I had spent my entire life surviving a master manipulator who was 10 times smarter than him. Patricia had taught me how to read the architecture of a lie. Vance was just a poorly rehearsed actor reading her script. I let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds. I opened my briefcase. I did not raise my voice when I finally spoke. I addressed Inspector Hayes directly, completely ignoring the lawyer's theatrical presence. "Inspector," I said smoothly, "I would like to enter my own exhibits into the official record." I pulled a pristine, time-stamped document from my briefcase and handed it across the table. "This is a formal conflict of interest report. It was filed, signed, and countersigned by my commanding officer at 8 o'clock in the morning on the day this investigation began. It explicitly details my father's attempt to leverage my clearance, and it formally removes me from any investigatory role." Hayes read the document carefully. The timestamp was undeniable. It predated any federal action. I pulled out a second folder. "Regarding the corporate registrations," I continued, my tone resembling a professor delivering a lecture, "I have provided a certified forensic handwriting analysis commissioned by the Federal Task Force. It concludes, with absolute certainty, that the signature on those documents is a digital composite, forged using a medical insurance form I signed 9 years ago." Vance shifted uncomfortably in his expensive chair. His confident smile began to tighten at the corners. He opened his mouth to object, but I did not give him the space to breathe. I placed a small USB drive next to the folders. "Finally, regarding the audio recording, the version Mr. Vance played has been maliciously spliced. This drive contains the complete unedited audio file, retrieved directly from my secured precinct communications log. I did not need to play it. The very existence of the unedited file was enough." I looked directly at Vance. "The complete sentence is, 'Give me the container numbers. I will handle it at the port by reporting it to the proper authorities. Do not call me again.'" I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands over my stomach. My mother designed these fail-safes specifically to frame me if the syndicate ever faced exposure. "Mr. Vance is currently presenting falsified evidence and manipulated audio to an internal law enforcement tribunal." I let that statement settle into the room. The implication was massive. Presenting forged evidence in an official proceeding was a fast track to disbarment and federal charges. Vance's face drained of colour. The arrogant sneer completely evaporated, replaced by a sudden, frantic realisation of his own legal exposure. He looked at the documents on the table as if they were venomous snakes. Inspector Hayes closed the folder containing my report. He looked at Vance, his expression hardening into active hostility. "Counsellor," Hayes said, his voice dropping an octave, "do you wish to formally submit these contested documents into my official investigation record?" Vance swallowed hard. He realised he had walked into a meticulously prepared ambush. He was a shark, but I had brought a harpoon. Vance remained entirely silent. The air in the Internal Affairs hearing room grew incredibly thick. Attorney Vance stared at the verified timestamp on my conflict of interest report. His foundational argument that I was a rogue, corrupt detective trying to eliminate my partners in crime had just evaporated. Inspector Hayes watched him with the predatory patience of a man who recognises a cornered animal, but Vance was paid an exorbitant retainer by Craig for a reason. He was a professional survivor. He quickly recalibrated, shifting his strategy from federal corruption to domestic greed. He closed the folder containing the forged documents and pushed it aside, attempting to dismiss his own massive error. He pulled a new, heavily highlighted contract from his designer leather briefcase. "Let us pivot to your financial motivations, Detective," Vance said, his voice regaining a fraction of its arrogant baseline. "My client's primary residence, the sprawling North Shore estate, carries a multi-million-dollar mortgage, a mortgage that you co-signed. You are listed on the deed as a joint tenant with rights of survivorship. With your father facing federal indictment and asset seizure, you stand to creatively consolidate that property under your sole ownership. You orchestrated this entire federal spectacle just to steal the family home. He looked at Inspector Hayes, trying to rebuild his narrative. He was attempting to paint me as a ruthless real estate opportunist. Craig had added my name to the deed years ago, specifically to leverage my impeccable credit score and steady municipal income to secure his massive loan. It was another mechanism of control, another chain binding me to their financial machinery. I did not flinch. I did not attempt to explain the nuances of financial abuse to a man paid to ignore them. Explanations are a defensive posture. I prefer defensive geometry. I opened my briefcase again. I withdrew a formally notarized document and placed it precisely in the centre of the table. This is a comprehensive quitclaim deed. I stated evenly. It was fully executed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk yesterday afternoon. I have legally and voluntarily surrendered any and all equity, claim, or financial interest I hold in the North Shore property, including any proceeds from its eventual federal liquidation. Vance stopped breathing. He stared at the blue notary stamp. I had just willingly burned hundreds of thousands of dollars of my own invested equity. I had severed the final financial tether binding me to Craig and Patricia's toxic empire. I sacrificed my own hard-earned money to ensure my motives remained entirely unassailable. I chose absolute legal clarity over a corrupted inheritance. I do not want their house, counsellor, I said quietly. I want a clean conscience. Vance had nothing left. Vance was visibly sweating now. The confident, theatrical attorney who had walked into the room 30 minutes ago was completely gone. His primary arguments had been systematically dismantled by indisputable paper trails, but Patricia had prepared him for every contingency. She knew my weakness was not money. She knew my only vulnerability was the child currently sleeping in my spare bedroom. Vance flipped to the final page of his desperately dwindling playbook. You may have surrendered the real estate detective, Vance said, his voice carrying a harsh, desperate edge. But you cannot mask your ultimate objective. You deliberately utilise Child Protective Services to forcibly remove a 7-year-old boy from his loving grandparents. You petitioned the family court for emergency placement. You kidnapped your own nephew under the guise of child welfare. Inspector Hayes narrowed his eyes, tracking the sudden shift to family law. And why would a career-focused detective suddenly want the burden of a child? Vance asked rhetorically, pointing an accusing finger across the table. Because that specific child is the sole beneficiary of a massive, heavily funded, irrevocable trust established by the late Harold. By securing physical custody of the boy, you gain complete, unrestricted access to manage those funds. This is not about justice. This is about a monumental cash grab. It was a brilliantly vicious accusation. It sounded perfectly logical to anyone who did not understand the intricate mechanics of forensic estate planning. I felt a deep, quiet gratitude for my late Uncle Harold. He had known Patricia's mind better than anyone. He had anticipated this exact, venomous manoeuvre. I pulled the final manila folder from my briefcase. Uncle Harold was a profoundly meticulous man. I told Inspector Hayes. He established the trust specifically to protect Leo from the financial predation of his own grandparents. I have provided the complete trust charter for your review. I slid the documents to Hayes. I am listed as the child's personal guardian, ensuring his physical and emotional welfare. However, I am legally barred from accessing a single cent of the principal. The trust is managed entirely by an independent third-party fiduciary firm in Boston. They directly pay the school tuition. They directly pay the medical providers. I cannot withdraw cash. I cannot buy a cup of coffee with that money. I turned my gaze back to Vance. His legal ammunition was completely exhausted. Every trap he tried to spring had been neutralised by proactive transparency. He had tried to weaponize my love for a vulnerable child, And he had failed spectacularly. The paperwork was an iron fortress. The truth was absolute. The hearing room was deadly quiet. Vance was staring blankly at the polished wood of the table. He was a man who realised he was standing on an active landmine. But he had one final, desperate instruction from Patricia. It was the absolute lowest form of legal warfare, designed to drain my resources and break my psychological endurance. If the Internal Affairs Division will not hold you accountable, Vance sneered, his voice dropping into a menacing whisper, my client, Patricia, is fully prepared to file a massive civil lawsuit against you. She will sue you for severe intentional infliction of emotional distress and elder abandonment. We will drag you through the civil courts for a decade. We will subpoena your colleagues, your friends, and your commanding officers. We will make your daily life a relentless, expensive nightmare until you return the boy and drop your federal cooperation. It was the false counterattack, a desperate illusion of power from a collapsing empire. He wanted me to react. He wanted me to show fear at the prospect of endless litigation. I simply smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the clinical smile of an auditor who has found the fatal discrepancy. Mr. Vance, I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. Are you aware of the contents of the hard drive seized from Patricia's home office by the Federal Task Force yesterday morning? He frowned, clearly caught off guard. I am not privy to ongoing federal seizures. I pulled a single, summarised sheet of paper from my coat pocket. Let me illuminate you. The technicians decrypted 3 hidden folders. They contain falsified ledgers, fabricated emails, and forged wire instructions. The first folder was meticulously designed to frame Craig as the sole mastermind of the smuggling ring. The second folder was designed to frame Logan. The third folder was designed to frame me. I leaned forward slightly. Patricia created 3 separate, highly illegal contingency plans to ensure she would walk away completely clean, regardless of who went to federal prison. She was prepared to sacrifice her husband, her son, and her daughter. I looked directly into Vance's eyes. If you file that civil suit, you will be formally representing a woman who has already forged documents to frame her own family. You will be tying your professional license to a radioactive client who views perjury as a standard operating procedure. Do you really want to risk federal disbarment for a woman who will undoubtedly turn on you the moment she feels cornered? Vance stared at me. The colour completely drained from his face. He looked down at the forged corporate documents he had previously submitted. He realised he was already perilously close to crossing the line into criminal complicity. He slowly gathered his papers, his hands visibly shaking. He did not say another word. He snapped his briefcase shut, stood up abruptly, and practically ran out of the hearing room. The lawyer fled the room. Inspector Hayes officially cleared me of all charges before the afternoon was over. The Internal Affairs investigation was closed, logged as a malicious fabrication. I returned to my desk, clipped my badge back onto my belt, and resumed my duties. Over the next 6 months, the federal wheels of justice ground Craig's empire into absolute dust. The indictments were unsealed in early winter. Craig stood in the federal courtroom, completely stripped of his bespoke suits and his arrogant bluster. He was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The prosecution presented the mountain of logistical evidence, the bank records, and the undeniable proof of widespread money laundering. But the most devastating blow did not come from the federal prosecutors. It came from Patricia, to secure a highly restrictive bail agreement and minimise her own exposure. Patricia had formally turned state's evidence. She sat at the witness stand, weeping delicate, manufactured tears, and meticulously detailed every aspect of Craig's illegal operations. She played the role of the terrified, controlled wife flawlessly. Craig stared at her from the defence table. The realization that the woman he trusted had been holding a knife to his back for decades finally shattered him. He looked old, broken, and entirely defeated. Logan did not fare much better. He was apprehended 3 weeks after his cowardly escape, pulled over for a broken taillight in a neighbouring state with a duffel bag full of stolen cash in his trunk. He tried to claim he was a victim of his parents' manipulation, but the paper trail of his extensive debts and his knowing participation in the money laundering structure sealed his fate. When the judge handed down the massive federal sentences for both Craig and Logan, I was not sitting in the gallery. I did not need to witness their physical incarceration to feel validated. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a case file for a completely unrelated robbery. Their philosophy had always been that family requires sacrifice. They had spent years demanding that I sacrifice my future, my money, and my peace of mind for their comfort. In the end, their toxic ideology consumed them entirely. Patricia sacrificed Craig, Logan sacrificed Leo. They all cannibalized each other to survive, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. They ate their own. Patricia avoided federal prison by leveraging her husband's downfall. But the court was not entirely blind. The RICO statutes aggressively seized everything connected to the illicit logistics revenue. The sprawling North Shore mansion was foreclosed and auctioned. The luxury vehicles were impounded. Her offshore accounts were permanently frozen and seized by the Treasury Department. Her elite circle of wealthy friends, terrified of federal subpoenas, completely vanished. She became a social ghost. On a rainy Tuesday evening, my phone rang. I recognized the number. It was a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. I answered it, placing the phone on my desk while I finished typing an email. Victoria. Patricia's voice came through the speaker. It was thin, lacking the polished resonance it once held. I have nothing left. The state took the house. I am staying in a room that smells like cheap bleach. I need you to send me $2,000 for rent and groceries. I am your mother. After everything we have been through, you cannot just abandon me. She was still attempting to play the familiar notes of the same old song. She still believed that biological connection was a universal override for absolute betrayal. She believed that guilt was a currency I was still willing to accept. I cannot send you money, Patricia, I said, my voice carrying the calm, steady rhythm of a metronome. My salary is clean. I will not mix it with your history. You are punishing me, she cried, a sharp, bitter edge creeping into her tone. You are a cruel, ungrateful daughter. I am not punishing you, I replied evenly. I am simply enforcing a boundary. You built a life on stolen assets and fraud. The math has finally caught up with the reality. You are an adult. Patricia, you must manage your own liabilities. I did not wait for her to unleash a tirade of insults. I pressed the red button and ended the call. The next morning, I went to the post office. I did not send her a check. I placed a thick stack of brochures into a manila envelope. They were applications for Section 8 public housing, food stamp enrolment forms, and the addresses of local community pantries. It was not an act of spite. It was the absolute final reality of her new life. I mailed the package with standard tracking. I felt absolutely nothing. The ledger was closed. It was a bright, crisp Sunday morning. Sunlight poured through the large windows of my apartment, illuminating the small dining table. The heavy, suffocating silence of the North Shore mansion felt like a distant nightmare. Here, the air smelled like freshly brewed coffee and vanilla pancakes. Leo was sitting at the table, his legs swinging slightly above the floor. He was drawing a picture of a police car with a bright blue crayon. He had been living with me for nearly a year. The family court, reviewing the staggering evidence of abandonment and the federal indictments against his father and grandfather, had officially granted me full, permanent guardianship. We had established a routine built on predictability, safety, and absolute transparency. I set a plate of warm pancakes in front of him. He looked down at the food, then looked up at me. His large eyes held a flicker of the old anxiety he used to carry in the mansion. "Aunt Victoria?" Leo asked, his voice hesitant and quiet. "When I get bigger and I get a job, do I have to pay you back for the breakfast and the school clothes?" I stopped pouring the syrup. The question shattered my heart. Not out of sadness, but out of a profound realization of what he had been taught. He had spent the first 7 years of his life in an environment where every interaction was a transaction. He had watched Patricia slide envelopes of bills across the dinner table. He had learned that love was just a debt waiting to be collected. I sat down in the chair next to him. I looked him directly in the eyes, ensuring my voice was completely steady and full of warmth. "No, Leo, you never have to pay me back for breakfast. You never have to pay for your clothes, or your room, or anything else." He blinked, trying to process a concept that completely defied his early programming. "In this house," I told him gently, placing a hand over his small one. "You do not have to pay money to be loved. You do not have to earn your safety. My job is to protect you, and your job is just to be a kid." A slow, tentative smile broke across his face. The anxiety melted from his shoulders. He picked up his fork and started eating his pancakes. I watched him in the sunlight. The cycle of extraction was finally broken. The trauma stopped here. We ate in peace. Time is the ultimate auditor. It separates the manufactured illusions from the enduring truths. 18 months after the federal raid on the logistics company, I stood in the assembly hall of the precinct headquarters. The room was filled with colleagues, mentors, and the quiet hum of absolute professional respect. The chief of police stood at the podium. He read a brief commendation detailing my integrity, my adherence to protocol under extreme personal pressure, and my unwavering commitment to the law. He did not mention my family by name. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew the story of the detective who handed her own syndicate over to the feds. I stepped forward, and the chief pinned the silver lieutenant's shield to the lapel of my dress uniform. I looked out into the crowd and saw Leo sitting in the front row. He was wearing a small suit, clapping enthusiastically next to Agent Miller, who had become a trusted mentor to both of us. Uncle Harold's independent trust was actively funding Leo's private education, ensuring the money was used to build a mind, not a criminal defence fund. I had found Eleanor, Leo's biological mother. She was stable, recovering, and we had established supervised, healthy visits. She wasn't ready to be a full-time mother, but she was grateful her son was safe. I had spent my youth believing that family was defined entirely by biological proximity. I had believed that sharing a bloodline meant sharing every financial burden, every toxic secret, and every manipulated lie. I was wrong. Biological connection is an accident of birth. True family is an architecture built on mutual respect, unwavering safety, and profound accountability. Craig and Patricia had tried to use my badge as a shield for their betrayal. They believed that manipulating the truth could alter reality. But I learned the most vital lesson of forensic investigation. Liars can constantly change the story, but they cannot erase the paper trails they leave behind. I stepped off the stage, holding my new shield, and walked toward the boy who finally knew what a real home felt like. We walked out into the bright Chicago afternoon, completely unburdened by the past. Have you ever had to draw a difficult, necessary boundary with someone who shared your bloodline? Share your perspective in the comments. Your insight might just be the exact validation someone else desperately needs to read today. Let the healing continue. The paper never lies,